Hello everybody, welcome to Crystal Shin TV. I am Crystal Shin and today I would like to share bedtime story with you. This is like a very boring story, Harry Potter. When I went to the movie theater, I just fell asleep because it was very boring. So I will read this book to you guys and hopefully you can sleep with this bedtime story. I suffered insomnia for very long, and the best way to get over insomnia is like first, you have to exercise a lot. Second, you have to read a lot of boring books at night, and this is one of the methods that I used. I read a lot of boring books or heard boring books, and it helped me fall asleep. So let's start from here. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dudley of number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Darcy was the director of a film called Groanings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Darcy was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dudleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dudleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dudley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dudley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as undudleyish as it was possible to be. The Dudleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the secret. The Dudleys knew that the Potters had a small son, too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dudley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside that suggests that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Darcy hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Darcy gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dudley picked up his briefcase, packed Mrs. Dudley on the check, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. Little Tyke chortled Mr. Darcy as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the secret that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Darcy didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Darcy blinked and stared at the cat. It started back as Mr. Darcy drove around the corner and up the road. He watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Private Drive. No looking at the sign. Cars couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dudley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about, people in cloaks. Mr. Darcy couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw on young people. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dudley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Darcy that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Darcy arrived in the groaning parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Darcy always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it hard to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl spread overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Darcy, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back to pass them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Darcy stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped as his secretary, not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receipt back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there was lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dudley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if it had a sister like that, but all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dudley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passers-by stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dudley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Darcy stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle. Whatever that was, he was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on the garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same marking around its eyes. "Shoo," said Mr. Darcy loudly. Okay, this is the end of today's reading. I hope now you are sleeping. Okay. Hope if you feel good about my channel, I hope you click like and subscribe my channel. It's Crystal Shin TV. I'll see you next time. Bye.